We're good to go. So hi, everybody. I'm Susan Zeiger. Greetings and good evening to you. I'm a program director at Primary Source, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our Primary Source online seminar series for spring 2019, Latin America and the Caribbean Today, Topics for the Classroom. Tonight, we'll look at the recent history of drug trafficking, violence, and immigration in the Americas and their complicated interrelationships. And we see this as a chance to get beneath the sound bites and the sensationalism and look quite a bit deeper at that important topic. We are very fortunate to have a gifted scholar to guide us through this complex material this evening. Professor Jorge Capetillo-Ponce is a sociologist from UMass Boston. He has presented in Primary Source face-to-face courses, and this is our first opportunity to broadcast his knowledge to a little bit of a wider audience. So we just want to say good evening to you, Jorge. We are so grateful to you for joining us tonight. He's just back from a trip overseas visiting Hungary. So it was especially nice of him to make time to be with us. I'll introduce Jorge more formally in a few moments, but let me just add that Jorge is a scholar who uses many different tools of social analysis to take a broad, systemic look at this web of issues. And I think you'll appreciate, as I do, the many different angles he'll show us on this topic that impacts thousands and thousands of people's lives, directly and indirectly, many, many thousands more, including the young people, many of them in your classrooms, and perhaps even those in your own families and communities. Then at the end of the session tonight, I wanted to tell you that I'll give a roundup of 5 favorite curriculum resources, speaking of our classrooms, selected by Primary Source staff and our teacher advisors for teaching about our topics for tonight. So these include the US-Mexico border, Central American migration, the drug wars, and the, so to speak, collateral damage that has come from them, and other topics on our agenda tonight. So please stay tuned for that as well. Now, let me say briefly that the webinar this evening is, oops, this is great, is part of a series that we have held this spring, and tonight we are in part 2 of that series, and coming up very shortly in just under 2 weeks, we have session 3, Democracy, Governance, and Civil Society, and that's a session with Professor Amy Risley of Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee on Monday evening, April 8th. So I hope many of you will be able to come back and join us for that. Amy studies comparative politics, and she'll give us a broad picture of the state of democracy across the region at present, some of the challenges and issues. And Amy has, I would say, was going to tell us that there are more reasons to be hopeful than we might think from reading the general U.S. news media. She'll also probe into and go into a deeper case study on the NGO and civil society sector, in particular the human rights activism. So I think there'll be some real inspiration along the way in that session as well. And later in the hour tonight, we'll have a designated block of time for your questions and comments, but we encourage you to begin entering your thoughts and queries when they occur to you. And you can use the control panel on the right. There's a question box where you can type in your questions. Those will be seen by the organizers of the session, by our staff, and not by others in the group. So feel free to put in what you'd like to know about, and then in the question and answer period, I'll be able to pose those questions to Professor Capetillo. And as we typically do, I just want to say this session will be recorded and linked on our Primary Source resource page and hosted on our YouTube channel. Finally, a brief word about our organization. Primary Source is a not-for-profit that partners with educators to bring global learning into K through 12 classrooms at schools. And this, we're very proud to say, is our anniversary year. We're 30 years old this year. The heart of our work is professional development for teachers. And to learn more about our organization, please visit our website, www.primarysource.org. Finally, I just want to thank my colleague, Christine Gonzalez, who is helping us tonight. And Christine will be on the line with us too and helping us make everything run smoothly. Thank you so much for all of your help. And now I am delighted to turn my attention and yours to our webinar topic this evening, Drug Trafficking, Violence, and Immigration in the Americas, a Complex Relationship. And as I said, we are honored to have with us this evening Jorge Capetillo, PhD, as our speaker. Jorge is Associate Professor of Sociology in the College of Liberal Arts at UMass Boston. And he is, I believe, also recently was or is still the acting chair of the Latino Studies program at the same campus. Jorge's scholarship and interests are broad, encompassing migrant and marginalized communities in the United States, social theory, social policy, foreign relations, and much else. He's co-authored, among his other works, a book called Migrant Marginality, a Transnational Perspective, and has done a study of Marxism and the Cuban Revolution, a really fascinating article framing the taxes and undocumented workers debate, a critical review of texts supporting pro-enforcement policies and practices. And he's also carried out research on local communities in the Boston area, including Blacks and Latinos, Latinas in Boston, and a Mayan language community in New Bedford, Mass. So these are all areas in which we can explore and converse with Professor Capetillo later tonight. But first, we are ready to hear Jorge's presentation. So Jorge, again, thank you for joining us. And we're going to turn on your microphone now. And Christine is going to help give us the controls. Let's see, the mic's not on quite yet. Okay, just a moment here. Jorge, can we hear you? No, not yet. Christine, I think we need to do the mic. Let's see. What did we do? It's self-muted. Jorge, yeah, I think Christine's going to get you set up there. Sorry, everyone. Just a momentary pause. Yes,
Hello? You can
now
hear
I
me?
can hear you. Welcome. Yeah, that sounds great. Okay. And now we're going to see if you've got the screen in just a moment. Try advancing to the next slide.
Okay. No?
Nope. Okay. We'll get you started. I'll be right there. Hold on. Okay, go ahead and get started, and I will make sure that the slides will move. Hold on one second. I'm going to come help you.
Okay. Yes, it's moving now. Well, good evening to everyone. Thank you to Susan for her presentation. My name is Jorge Capetillo. As she said, I am Associate Professor of Sociology and Latino Studies at UMass Boston. Before I begin today's presentation, I just want to mention that the relationship between drug trafficking, immigration, and violence in the American continent is very complex, with numerous interrelated components and scenarios. Thus, in the 30 to 40 minutes of my presentation, I will present briefly the issues that I feel are central to this debate and will give more weight to Central America and Mexico. I want to leave enough time to address your questions and comments after my talk. We will have around 20 minutes to do so. Most transnational organized crime is very systemic or market-based. As long as supply and demand exist, removing particular intermediaries is not sufficient to destroy the market. This is especially true in a globalized world. For example, hundreds of thousands of people are illegally smuggled into the United States each year, a flow far beyond the capacity of any organized group to manage. Instead, thousands of smugglers ply the trade in an open market with low barriers to entry. The same is true of the illegal wildlife trade in Southeast Asia, or the counterfeit goods business in East Asia, or firearms trafficking in most of Africa. In order to make an analysis possible, we can say that in Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, we find two types of groups that are clashing over drug trade and immigration with the resulting violence. One is territorial groups. Another one is trafficking groups. These two types, there are other two, but I'll go first into these two types. These two types of groups are completely different in character. Territorial groups are focused on controlling territory and taxing activity within this domain. Trafficking groups are hardly groups at all, but rather networks of suppliers, transporters, and receivers, as would be encountered in any illicit supply chain. In the region, they are often referred to as transportistas. Much of the violence in the region today is about the growing control of territorial groups over transnational trafficking. This produces conflicts between territorial groups and the transportistas, as well as conflict between territorial groups themselves. Within these two broad headings, there are many distinct variations. Some territorial groups focus almost exclusively on preying on cocaine traffickers and are known as tumbadores in the region. One type of territorial group, the street gang, is more about identity than illicit commerce. There are street gangs throughout the region. Both those in the north, known as maras, are particularly violent. I will go in more detail about street gangs in particular when I talk about Central America. There are few parts of the world where there is truly no one in control. Human beings are social creatures, and when left to their own devices, naturally self-organize along hierarchical lines. Even in the most war-torn and desolate areas, strong men emerge to monopolize force and bring order to people's lives. The classic territorial organized crime group is a kind of state substitute, imposing order in areas that the formal state has neglected or cannot fully control. In industrialized society, this typically involves a geographic area, often urban. New immigrants and other socially excluded people often lack access to security, to adjudication of disputes, to job markets, to credits, and to other amenities provided to better establish residents. What we call organized crime often starts as a mechanism for providing many of these services. For new immigrants and other vulnerable people, the first concern is security. Those who eventually become organized criminals may start out as public-minded youth, defending their community from the predation of those who would exploit its marginal status. Over time, these neighborhood watches can morph into informal private security operations, where the community defenders are supported through voluntary contributions. As more time passes, these contributions may no longer be completely voluntary, but rather imposed as a kind of tax, and the operation becomes a protection racket. Once the neighborhood is completely dominated, the racketeers may victimize, unopposed, the community they once protected. This sort of territorial domination requires enforcement capacity. In other words, something like an army. There must be a clear hierarchy and a chain of command, or control will soon be lost to better organized groups. Families may form the head of the group, often a patriarch or patriarchs and their sons, with bonds of blood allowing trust in pursuits where trust is often lacking. There must be captains, foot soldiers, informants, and aspirants, concentric circles of authority radiating from the central leadership. Without the formal mechanisms for mediating disputes, loyalty and fealty are paramount, and disloyalty is punishable by death. These territory-bound groups are intensely concerned with local affairs, and this limits the scope of what they can do. They can demand tribute or extortion, give credit at usurious rates, loan sharking, and dictate local employment conditions, labor racketeering, within their zones of influence. With their money and community standing, they can even affect voting outcomes and wield considerable political clout. They may move into high-level corruption, such as public procurement fraud. Once securing their status as political patrons, they can engage in acquisitive crime at will, selling stolen property and smuggling goods with impunity. So now that we have a brief notion of how criminal groups come together, and of course these groups are one of the main reasons for the rising violence and migration south of the U.S. border, and especially from Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, I want to briefly mention the major trends of drug trafficking and organized crime in the Americas in the last 3 decades. 8 factors or causes are prominent: increased globalization of drug consumption, partial victories and unintended consequences of US-led war on drugs, proliferation of areas of drug cultivation and drug smuggling routes, the balloon effect, which I will talk about later, the dispersion, fragmentation of organized criminal networks, or the cockroach effect, failure of reform and state building efforts, failures of US domestic drug, crime, and immigration policies, ineffectiveness of regional, international drug and immigration control policies, and this is more recent, growth in support for harm reduction, decriminalization, and legalization policy alternatives. Due to the limited time I have for this presentation, I will focus on the most relevant trends for my talk, and then discuss such geographical regions as Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. In my concluding remarks, I will give more time to the immigration issue. The globalization of drug consumption. Many Latin American political leaders have long argued that if the US population did not consume such large quantities of illegal drugs, if there were not so many Americans drug addicts and users, then Latin American and Caribbean countries would not produce such large quantities of illegal drugs like marijuana, cocaine, and heroin for export, and the region would not be plagued by powerful and well-financed drug trafficking organizations, what often called cartels, that have sprung throughout the hemisphere. It is certainly accurate to claim that the United States has been for decades, and remains today, the largest single consumer market for illicit drugs on the planet. Although there are no definite estimates, the value of all illicit drugs sold annually in the United States may reach as high as $150 billion. Some $30 billion per year may be spent on cocaine alone. Nonetheless, illegal drug use or addiction is not uniquely American disease. Over the last decade, the now 27 countries of the European Union have increased from 4.3 to 4.8 million cocaine users, which represent 30% of the worldwide consumption in cocaine, for example. Europeans are almost closing the gap with approximately 5 million regular cocaine users found in the United States. Indeed, levels of cocaine use in the United States have dropped steadily since the early 1990s, while cocaine consumption in Europe exploded exponentially during the first decades of the 21st century. In fact, the number of cocaine users in the 4 European Free Trade Acts countries doubled in the last 15 years. Afghanistan leads the world in heroin production, producing 380 metric tons per year. Then after that, Mexico is about 10% of the heroin consumption, and Colombia about 1%. Cocaine, in contrast, is produced in only 3 countries in the Western Hemisphere: Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Cocaine is trafficked from these 3 Andean countries to 174 countries around the globe. Now I want to talk a little bit about the partial victories and defeats in the Andean war on drugs. From the middle of the 19th century through the mid-80s, Peru and Bolivia were the 2 principal country suppliers for both coca leaf and refined cocaine to the U.S. The partial victories achieved by U.S.-led war on drugs in the southern Andes in these countries during the late 1980s and early 90s rapidly shifted cocaine cultivation in the region to Colombia in the mid-1990s. In the early 1990s, Colombia US-backed all-out war against drug lord Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel during the Cesar Gaviria administration led to Escobar's death in December of 1993 and the rapid dissolution of the Medellin cartel, and a few years later of the Cali cartel. The problem is that, and that's the balloon effect, the problem is that once the drug trade, for example, in cocaine is like a balloon. Once you push in one side, the cocaine goes to another one. So when Bolivia and Peru were, there was this a U.S.-backed war on drugs, the cocaine went to Colombia. After, in the 1990s, after the all war against drugs in Colombia, the drug trade moved to Mexico. Mexico's current drug-related bloodbath, in part directly attributable to the partial victory in the war of drugs achieved in Colombia in recent years via Plan Colombia. Since 2005, the US-backed Merida initiative implemented in Mexico achieved results similar to those of Plan Colombia. But it did not halt drug trafficking or end organized crime in Mexico or the region. The outcome was that it pushed many smugglers' activities and criminal networks operations into neighboring countries such as Guatemala and Honduras and back to Colombia. Let's see the Mexico-US border. So yes, in the past 10, 15 years, Mexico has been the country that has controlled and the drug traffic from South America, and of course, smuggle it into the United States. Nowhere in the world is the potential difference between states greater than along the border of Mexico and the United States. The crossing points between these two countries, known locally as plazas, are the basis for many of the Mexican territorial criminal groups. But the groups are heterogeneous, and the most successful are those that do not fit the traditional model. There are two that today eclipse all others, and these are the only two relevant to Central America and the Caribbean: the Cartel del Pacifico, an alliance between Sinaloa Federation and the Gulf Cartel. This cartel, of course, many of you have heard of El Chapo. No, he was the chief of this cartel, and until he was apprehended, and now he's in New York. And the other one is the Zetas, Los Zetas. The Sinaloa cartel originates from the state of Mexico, most associated with drug production, Sinaloa. Unlike many of the other drug trafficking organizations, the Sinaloa cartel has not focused exclusively on cocaine, but has long produced and trafficked marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamine. This group, when it's called now a federation, the Sinaloa cartel, this has given it a more business-like approach, but it has also led into conflict. So the conflict today, and much of the bloodbath, is between the cartel and the other cartel is the Zetas. The Zetas did not start out as a territorial group at all, but as the coercive wing of the Gulf cartel. They have no territorial affinity, but they do, as illegal armed group, have the ability to conquer and hold trafficking areas. These two rivals conduct their affairs in Central America through proxies and local allies. For the most part, representatives of the Cartel del Pacifico or the Zetas may be spotted negotiating deals abroad. But it is rare for them to be directly involved in foreign operations. When they need something accomplished south of the Mexican border, they can generally contract this work out to their contacts in the region. This region is, of course, what is called the Northern Triangle. I will talk a little bit more about the Mexico-US border at the end, but I want to focus on this Northern Triangle in Central America, which has become very prominent because of the caravans and the zero tolerance politics of the Trump administration. The Northern Triangle is constituted by three countries: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Recently, policymakers, there are two regions, of course, in Central America. You have the northern region, which these three countries that I just mentioned, and the southern region with Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, which are not are labor importing countries. It's a very different situation what is happening in those three countries that is what is happening in the north. These three countries share some important common characteristics. Central America, particularly countries in the Northern Triangle, face extreme violence inflamed by transnational organized crime and drug trafficking. According to the United Nations Drug Organization, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras now have some of the highest homicide rates in the world. There is little doubt, therefore, that these transnational issues present major challenges to countries within the region and to the wider international community. Criminal networks and their activities disrupt stability, undermine democratic institutions, and hinder the economic activity so vital to the region.
Jorge, sorry to
Yes.
interrupt. It's wonderful. I think you maybe want to advance the slide to for Central America for the Northern Triangle. I think we have a slide ahead.
Yeah, oh, sorry, that's right.
Yeah, there you go.
Here we go,
There you go.
Central America.
That'll be helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Sure.
These countries share many common characteristics. They are poor, with high levels of unemployment, and little respect for or control by the government. They are also important transit zones for contraband products and drugs, with hundreds of illegal border crossings known as puntos ciegos, or blind spots in the region. In addition to these components that have greatly enhanced violence and related migration to the north, we should mention that other external shocks over the last decade or so included the unintended effects of authorities' measures to combat drug trafficking and a reduction in the U.S. market for cocaine, which has meant trafficking groups are now competing for a share in a smaller pot of profits. One factor has been Mexico's anti-drug strategy since 2006, which, as noticed in previous reports, has greatly increased the trafficking of US-bound drugs through Central America. Before I go a little bit more into detail, I wanted to talk a little bit about, there is a lot of talk of the street gangs in Central America. I'm sure many of you have heard of Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, and M18. These groups these groups are sometimes they are characterized as culprits in the drug trade, and even they have been dubbed as terrorist groups, but they are neither. They are classical territorial organized crime groups, almost entirely of youth, very young and very inexperienced groups. In the region, they are usually not classified as organized crime groups because their focus is not financial gain. Being comprised of impulsive young people, most street gangs lack the capacity to engage in state functions. They might provide security for interlopers, and their money may benefit family and friends, but they generally do not engage in any pretense of being community servants. They are intensely concerned with local affairs, however. For them, territorial control is about identity, about respect, about their place in the world. This orientation causes them to act against the financial interest. The Maras of Central America are string gangs. They are often referred as transnational gangs, but this term is misleading. They do have an international origin and exist in several countries, but there is very little evidence that this has changed their central focus on local affairs. It is also claimed that Mara groups have gone beyond their street focus to acquire a political, even insurgent character, engaging in behavior that has been described as terrorism, such as mass executions of innocents. In most instances, however, these incidents were tied to pre-existing extortion operations, particularly regarding public transport. The traffickers of cocaine in Colombia, in Mexico, they don't want to depend on very inexperienced people like these street gangs. So they might use it. They might use these street gangs to do petty smuggling within the areas, within the countries, but they will not let them. The operation. The operation is being conducted by these cartels, by these federations, which are really enterprises with people that are prepared and that have professional experience in doing this type, of of control, of accounting, of smuggling. These are what the cartels do. These are not things. These are not tasks that the street gangs do. I want to talk a little bit about the Caribbean before I give my final comments. Most Caribbean states are small in size and poor in economic and military resources, and thus vulnerable to actions by both state and um, non-state actors. The regional proximity to the United States shape is as make for illicit as well as licit flows, including the movement of commercial goods, drugs, and migrants to the United States, and money and tourists from it. In this way, the United States is both a principal driver in the region's security challenges as well as its principal source of trade, investment, and other resources. Despite attempts at integration, the region is also defined by fragmentation, only partly surmounted through organization such as CARICOM and the Organization of East Caribbean States. Transregional criminal flows and their linkage to and impact on local populations are arguably the greatest source of violence and threat to governance in the Caribbean. The dynamic is driven by the location of the region between the hemisphere's largest market for drugs and people, the United States, and South America, its largest source of both. With respect to drugs, the deterioration of governance in Venezuela has complemented efforts by transport groups and overland drug routes in Central America to increase narcotic shipments. The Venezuelan crisis has helped very much the drug trade in Central America, in South America. The same thing that the coup d'état in 2009 in Honduras, which unfortunately was supported by the Obama administration, was the spark for all the Honduran drug trafficking, and after that, of course, the Honduran immigration, to the United States, the famous caravans that we've been talking about. No? With respect to people, the Caribbean is a channel for human trafficking and smuggling for multiple groups moving persons to the United States, including Chinese triads, as well as immigration to the United States from the region itself. To a degree, previous patterns of migration have also created national criminal links between local groups and the United States. Examples include the previous Jamaican-based organizations, known as Shower Post, in New York, in Miami, and of course in New York too. The Dominican Republic in the United States has contributed to a significant role of Dominican gangs in the smuggling of drugs to the US East Coast, to New York and Boston. The Dominican Republic has become the most popular tourist destination in the Caribbean, with more than 6 million visitors a year, a primary crossroads of cocaine and heroin from South America, and the country with the highest prevalence of HIV in the region. To conclude, I want to put together the above-mentioned components of drug and violence in order to explain how they are engines that promote migration to the United States. There is no question that the drug trade itself and the violence it generates has a devastating impact throughout the region. Drug trafficking breeds criminality, exacerbates criminal and political violence, and fuels armed groups. It greatly increases problems of citizen security, public order, and ultimately law enforcement. Across the region, drug trafficking-related corruption has further weakened national and local governments, judiciaries, and police force.
Jorge, sorry to break in again. If you advance your slide, we'll get to see your
There we go.
outline. Perfect.
I always forget.
You're doing great.
Violent crime associated with the drug trade escalates accordingly. The social fabric, particularly in poor urban areas in the region, where both drug use and drug-related violence tend to be highest, is torn apart. And as a result, we have waves of immigrants seeking refuge in the United States. The drug trade is more like a balloon than a battlefield. When one part of a balloon is squeezed, its contents are displaced to another. Similarly, when coca production is suppressed in one area, it quickly pops up somewhere else, disregarding national borders. Arrested drug lords are quickly replaced by others who move up the ranks. That is called the cockroach effect. Dismantled cartels are replaced by smaller, leaner operations that are harder to detect and deter. When drug trafficking routes are disrupted by intense interdiction campaigns, they are simply shifted elsewhere. In short, this supply-side approach in fighting drug trafficking has been a failure. The domestic debate around immigration, what the Trump administration called zero tolerance policy on illegal immigration, is another simplistic solution that would probably end in failure, simply because that debate is entirely focused on domestic policy, how to treat the undocumented after they have arrived. Democrats, thinking Latinos will vote for them, want the newcomers to stay. Republicans, fearing Democrats are right, want them sent back. Employers want their cheap labor. Workers fear their wage competition. The clash of these agendas further inflames simmering social tensions over racism, police tactics, and cultural identity, which in turn feed Trump's reactionary base. Lost in these US-centric arguments is the role of our foreign policy in creating the conditions that push people in Central America and Mexico to make the long, arduous, and frequently fatal track north. For at least 150 years, the United States has intervened with arms, political pressure, and foreign aid in order to protect the business and military elites of these countries who have prospered by impoverishing their people. Still, illegal immigration from the region remained modest until the 1980s, when the US government and its neoliberal collaborators at the IMF and World Bank began imposing policies on the region that favored large multinational corporations, undercutting the small farms and businesses that have supported the working poor. Meanwhile, many of the oligarchs became partners in the growing narcotic business. Protected by government officials, criminal gangs have spread throughout the region, adding threats of kidnapping, extortion, rape, and murder to the daily life of people trying to make a living. Many immigrants argue that unless you are connected to one of the families that run these countries, for example, the three countries in the northern, Guatemala, the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, there is no future here. Either you work for the narcos or you go north. The US response has been a war on drugs that provides these same oligarchs with political protection and more weapons. In 2009, for example, what I just mentioned, the Obama administration ensured the success of a coup by Honduran military against an elected president, whose modest social programs of food and education for the poor had enraged the ruling class. Since then, US aid to Honduras oligarchs has more than doubled. Yet 2/3 of Hondurans live in poverty. Large numbers inhabit shacks without toilets and can afford to buy shoes for their children. And the murder rate among Latin American countries is second only to El Salvador, which has received even more US aid. The ruling class in Mexico, despite the country's greater size and nationalist culture, has a similar relationship to the United States. The 1994 NAFTA agreement sold to Congress as a way to keep Mexicans home threw millions of peasants and small business out of work. Illegal immigration from Mexico doubled. Over the past 10 years, the United States has given Mexico $2 billion in technology and training to fight drugs. Yet, as an international coalition of human rights groups reported last August, the documented cases of government-connected assassinations, torture, and disappearances of activists, journalists, and ordinary people keep piling up. I think I will stop here. Maybe I'll just make four final points.
Great.
First, while migration has continued, shaped by demand for foreign labor and security in the region, there seems to be slowing rather than increasing migration patterns relative to the total number of migrants. Second, there are economic implications for the Northern Triangle countries because family remittances currently are the driving force of economic growth. Under the current model of economic growth, economic opportunities will remain limited. Slowing migration not only affects the receiving of remittances, but also long-term transnational engagement, including family ties. Third, given the continuing apprehensions and deportations, the problem of job generation and reintegration is not negligible. For example, deportations alone amount to half of the annual labor force growth in El Salvador. However, the skill set of those returned, the people that return from the United States to Central America, many of whom have been at least 10 years out of the home country, is suited to the U.S. labor market rather than the home country. When they get to Guatemala or El Salvador, there are much more, they have skills much more advanced than the type of jobs that they encounter there. Fourth and last, the demand for foreign labor in the United States is not negligible. There are many activities in the U.S. economy that are requiring low-skilled foreign workers. Construction, domestic work, and caring for children and the elderly are important drivers of migration. With declining migration, it is difficult to find short-term practical solutions and mitigating strategies for U.S. labor shortages. I think I will stop here, and I hope that we can have Q&A session at this moment. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jorge. You have given us such a wide-ranging overview of this issue, and there is a lot for us to unpack. So I'm looking forward to some discussion and some follow-up questions. I want to remind our attendees again, we're so glad that you were able to join us tonight, and please do feel free to go ahead and put your questions into the question box, and we'll take a look at those. I'm glad to see that already some have started to come in, which is great. And let's see. So, Jorge, let me start with a question first, and then we'll move forward. Could you talk a bit more about a couple of things I wanted to hear a bit more about? So I'm interested in the role of Mexico and how you see that evolving. You said you made the very good point that in many ways Mexico follows the fate of the Northern Triangle countries in its economic status in relation to the United States and that asymmetrical relationship. But we've also seen Mexico in a way becoming a kind of an enforcer for the United States in certain ways too, and playing a role of leadership over those countries. Can you talk a little bit more about that emerging relationship between Mexico and its neighbors to its south and the north? And does that question make sense?
Yes, yes, of course it makes sense. The well, there was a change of president in Mexico a few months ago, as many of you know. The prior president Peña Nieto, which was the first one he invited. I remember he invited Trump to Mexico City during the campaign, and then he was pressured by the Trump administration to stop the migration from the Northern Triangle, to stop this migration at Mexico's southern border, so they will not come into Mexico, and then from Mexico into the United States. Mexico has especially it was different with Obama administration. With the Obama administration, there was a more coordination between Mexico and the United States, and the Obama administration was how can I put it, more it was happier with Mexico in the sense that they understood how difficult this control in the southern border of Mexico was. Trump, of course, demanded that Mexico, stop the traffic of Mexico has done some of that. Yes, Mexico has actually, especially and now with the new president, who's a very the new president of Mexico, López Obrador, is a very nationalistic president and also populist and from the left.
Hmm.
And he at the beginning went to he has much better relations with Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras.
Hmm.
But what Mexico would like, and he's been trying to get the United States to do, is to Mexico and the United States to invest in these countries in order to stop the migration to the north. It's impossible for Mexico to stop this migration. It really is. It's, the migration is there is a very long border, and the migration there is through very. It's not like the Mexican U.S. border. It's mostly jungles, and it's very difficult to control.
Hmm.
And so Mexico is really in the middle. Would like to appease the Trump administration, and they have done some repression of the migrants, but at the same time they know that if there is not a comprehensive treaty with the United States to really invest in jobs and invest in infrastructure and security in these countries, things are not going to change.
That's a very helpful answer. Thank you. Well, one of our participants, Gabriel, has asked, and I think it's a parallel question to go back to the Caribbean, which is just great that you had that comparative perspective, Jorge, and we hear much less about the Caribbean, I think, in relation to these issues. But one of our participants tonight, Gabriel, has asked, what do you think that the Dominican government can do anything to protect their people from this negative situation? He understands that at least 1% or more of the drugs that go through the DR stay in the DR, and so that's having a negative impact as well. Do you have a sense of what countries like the Dominican Republic or Jamaica or other countries in the region can do to try to create what would be a drug a drug fighting policy that would have a more beneficial effect? I think is an extension of what Gabriel was asking.
If we think that Mexico has limited powers to control migration and drug trade,
Mm.
the small islands from the Caribbean, they really have very little. I mean, that's one of the main problems is really the lack of security capabilities in places like you mentioned, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti. Other countries, those three, for example, in Cuba there is more control. But if we stay with the Dominican Republic, the Dominican Republic has it's a huge market, 6 million tourists a year, and it has become a center for with the Venezuelan crisis. All these, remember, Venezuela also is a Caribbean country. It has a very large Caribbean coast, and it has Caribbean islands too, Margarita and others. No, with Venezuela at this moment is a failed state. There is no one is in control of Venezuela. So it's very difficult right now. The drug trade in the Caribbean has multiplied amazingly. I think this is actually a huge problem, and it has not been really talked about too much. And of course, the places where they go is where there is more money. And where is more money? When there is more tourism. And where is there more tourism? The Dominican Republic. No? The Dominican Republic, Jamaica, a little bit of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Haiti, of course, Haiti is another problem because Haiti, you don't have tourism, but Haiti there's no real government at this moment in Haiti. So Haiti has really become a place where the drug traffic with from Colombia and Venezuela in very fast boats They, they're the place where they come, they unload the drugs, and from there they go into the United States, especially Florida, of course, no? Florida, but also Texas and New Orleans, Louisiana, etc. So at this time, I don't see. What I see is that things are going to get worse in the Caribbean because
Mm.
precisely because what's going on with Venezuela in particular.
Oh, that's perfect because Christine asked a question that you've just segued into. She wanted to know the impact that the situation in Venezuela has had on this larger situation, and you've already addressed it in relation to the washover into the Caribbean. Are there other features to that are worth noting? Jorge, what else would you add, if anything?
Well, the Venezuela crisis has, there is about nobody really knows how many people have left Venezuela, but some estimates it's about 3 million people, about 10% of the population. That's a huge amount of people that have gone into Colombia mainly, but also Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, other places. Um, the problem, I mean, what are they doing? These people, the Venezuelans that are fleeing, Venezuela at this moment, they are into any type of illegal. They are illegal. They are refugees. So they don't have, and Colombia and Brazil, they don't have the money to keep refugee camps. So they are doing all kinds of, illegal activities, and many of them have to do with drugs,
Mm,
with human trafficking, with prostitution, etc.
right.
So I guess we don't understand really the dimension of the Venezuelan problem. It's a huge problem that it has not happened in South America ever. There has never been such a debacle, kind of like a melting down of a country the way that Venezuela, which by the way was the richest country in South America.
Wow, that was really interesting answer and so sad, but very helpful. The questions are really excellent, and I have another one here from Susanna. I think we're flowing so nicely, one from the other. But Susanna has asked us. Asked you, Jorge, this question, thinking about US foreign policy, which you brought up. You mentioned the role of regime change and the war on drugs. She said, can you speak more about other aspects of US foreign policy that also have an impact on the situation that you're speaking about tonight?
Well, the problem precisely is that there is no other. The problem. I think that the Obama administration had a more multi, multi dimensional approach
Mm-hmm.
to the problem of drug trafficking. They were understanding that one of the, for example, the investment of the United States was in security, and it was also in helping the countries in Central America to build a new judicial apparatus structure in the region. The problem with the Trump administration's approach is that this zero tolerance is only the idea that we don't want people coming in, and that's just not the way the foreign policy at this moment of the United States towards the region. In the case of Mexico, it's different, of course. Why? Because there is a lot of Mexico is a much larger country, and there is a lot of interrelations between the economies of the United States and Mexico. But regarding for example, the Northern Triangle and the Caribbean, the only thing is to what is the foreign policy or the domestic policy? Well, send more troops to the border, and ask Mexico and pressure Mexico to control the. There is no. I think again that the foreign policy of the United States should really. I think Mexico is ready to invest in Central America, for example, but the United States doesn't want to invest in the only way is to really upgrade the economy, upgrade the judicial system, and upgrade the security system. In Honduras, after the coup d'etat of 2009, there is no security system. Really, the ones who are controlling Honduras are drug traffickers, armies in drug traffickers, much more than street gangs. They're really like more, how can I say, more structured, larger types of of um, of cartels that have connections with Mexico, for example, with Los Zetas, with the Pacific, with the Gulf cartel. Um, I don't see any other way besides that. I don't see how. I think I actually see things getting worse in Honduras, in Guatemala, and in El Salvador.
Mhm.
The levels of violence in these three countries are the highest in the world at this moment,
Hmm.
higher than Syria in El Salvador, for example.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying, that we have the problem of quote unquote failed states, but
Yeah.
we also have the problem of a failed sort of a non-policy, that we're doing nothing but try to slam the door and keep people out. But there are no none of the more traditional U.S. In forms of involvement that might have actually had some beneficial effects as well as some negative ones too. But that's very interesting. You've given, I think, a useful way to think about the Obama era and its Latin American policy, because of course Obama has been criticized by people on the left for what was really a very tough anti-immigrant set of policies. In some ways, it pales in comparison to the current administration, but it sounds like Obama might have been pairing that with attempts at building up the judiciary and do some state building. Is that a fair
That's
assessment?
very good. That's very well
Yeah.
put, Susan. What I see, the Obama administration was deporting more people than the Trump administration. um, uh,
Yeah.
and but it was not bragging about it like
Hmm.
the Trump administration.
Hmm.
Second, they were trying to invest in security, in judicial infrastructure in the country. The Obama administration had many faults too. I mean, the support for the coup in Honduras was a huge mistake. In fact, that was really the one that made Honduras a failed state, and then made Honduras two things: a perfect place for as for drug trafficking, and second, that's when all these waves of thousands of people started leaving the country. They could not live in that type of violence anymore. So the thing with the Trump administration is that it's only based, and it's also really I mean the uh, I think the Obama administration had many faults, but would not you know make like I say, brag, or make a big thing about the caravans, for example. No, remember
Hmm.
when the caravans were coming, and Trump was sending people to the border, etc. Or the idea of the wall. The idea of the wall, for example. Well, the idea of the wall is such a simplistic way of really thinking. I mean, it didn't it has the walls have never worked anywhere in China, in Israel, in other places. They have not worked, and he thinks it's going to work here. So with this type of mindset of the administration, the Trump administration, I just don't see how things are going to. I think that it's going to get more violent, and I think that I don't know what's going to happen if Trump, stays in power. I think that's going to be the border with Mexico is going to completely be militarized. And
Well,
yes,
that's
yeah.
so, yeah, we are so in sync. We have our whole group here. So Lisa Hayes asked a great question, which I think is perfect to bring in right here too. She asked, just very straightforwardly, what impact do you feel a wall or barrier across the entire border would have on these issues of drug trafficking and migration? Okay, do you have if the wall were to be built, do you have a prediction about what kinds of consequences we'd see?
Well, I mean, Well, it depends how the wall. First, this idea of the wall. We never really understood what kind of wall he wanted. Second, there are some places in the Mexico-U.S. border that you cannot build a wall. Third, there are a lot of there are a lot of people that that have their private property, so they
Mm,
they have to buy. Another one, you have a lot of indigenous, Native American and Native Mexican uh, communities that live on the border, and they're not going to leave that because they've been living there for thousands of years. So it's very complicated. The idea of really making a 2,000-mile wall. I think
mm,
also, if you remember how good El Chapo, for example, El Chapo was one of the best tunnel makers in the world. I mean, he was wonderful. I mean, for that, there's one thing that he was very good at. He made 200 or 300 tunnels. So you can make, and then you have a tunnel, and then another tunnel, another tunnel. I don't see I think if the markets, if the drug market is here, there will always be ways to you know to smuggle the
mhm.
drug into, and also smuggle people into the United States.
So that's interesting. Thank you. That was a nuanced answer. So first of all, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. Where you're seeing years of conflict, litigation, and so forth ahead, and technical problems, and then
That's right.
really
That's right.
dubious how much impact it would really have in general.
That's right.
The balloon effect means that the drugs will go somewhere else somehow and
That's
find a
right.
way.
The balloon
Yeah.
effect and the
Mhm.
cockroach effect.
And the
No, the
cockroach
cockroach.
effect, right? Right.
That you get rid of El Chapo, and then there is 20 more Chapos coming.
Oh, that's the cockroach effect. Okay.
The cockroach effect. Yeah. You get one. You squash one, and then you have all other cockroaches come around and taking over. I mean, that's the cockroach effect, and it's true. It's true. This idea, the idea of getting, I think, and I think that the Mexican government at least has noticed it. This idea of getting big drug lords like El Chapo is not working out.
Hmm.
Who's in charge of El Chapo's empire? His son,
Oh.
his cousin, his nephew.
Hmm.
It's not. That's not going to work. That's never going to work.
Hmm.
You know, it's not getting the. Of course, it's kind of like a big, news that, oh, we got El Chapo. Yes, but that did not that did not stop drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is actually higher now than when El Chapo was caught.
Hmm. Well, Jorge, you always are so great at answering questions. I wanted to thank you for all of those. Those are excellent, and our participants are thanking you as well for a lot of those answers. I want to ask one more that will move us toward the last part of the evening, where I'll just talk a little bit about some of the teaching approaches for this material. But you teach Latin American studies, of course, yourself, and so I wanted to ask you this. This seems very challenging to me, and I'm honestly interested to know how you had answered it. I'm not sure what you would say, but I see that there's a certain risk in teaching this topic of drug trafficking and violence
Mm.
with U.S. students, because it has the potential to reinforce views of Latin America as a region that's dominated by criminality, by social breakdown, by the kind of sadistic violence that we read about, and that's so sensationalized by the press too. So, do you teach about drug trafficking in your own courses? Do you find that you can help your students to navigate through the complexity of understanding it in context, understanding that this is not the whole story about the region, or how
Well,
making it too sensational? What are your
yeah.
thoughts about that?
Yes, I see what you're saying, and it's true what you say, that it can breed or enforce stereotypes that we have. But sometimes I've taught, I teach Latino studies in the Latino history of the United States, and we have to understand that the history of Latin America and the United States, it's a very complex one, and also it's a very it's one that has been marked by colonialism, by in the part of the United States, and by the idea of managing kind of this back, the back door of the United States, the garden of the United States, which was called Latin America, in very authoritarian ways. So many of the and this happened also in Europe. You have a lot of this idea that, well, you have a lot of immigration in Europe coming. Where do they come from? They come from the countries that were colonialized by Europe. The same thing happened in all these type of policies, foreign policy of the United States has had the effect of driving people out of Latin America and into the United States. That is why today the largest minority group in the United States is it's a Latino group, close to 50 million people. It's a very, very large group. It's about always it's 17 to 20% of the population. Where do they come from? Well, they come from precisely these countries. If for example, let's stay with Honduras. If the Obama administration would have, instead of letting the coup go ahead in Honduras, would have supported the Honduran government and invested in Honduras, we would not have these caravans today.
Hmm.
See, the problem is you cannot take you cannot blame everything in Latin America. You also have to see the blame of the United States in the foreign policy on one side, and the other side in the drug consumption. The United States is the largest drug consuming country in the world by far. So
Mhm.
it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not. There's no easy answers here, and it's and yeah. I think we should try to avoid stereotypes, but sometimes the stereotypes have a bit of truth in them. There's no question
Yeah.
about that.
Well, that's a very thoughtful answer. I thank you for that. We can avoid uh, othering Latin Americans in this particular scenario when we realize that we've seen the enemy and the enemy is us too. That, so to speak, that we're making this
That's right.
problem too. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
We're all invested in this
In this
problem.
problem.
And that's the problem. The problem that this administration has
Mhm.
done is precisely what you just said, making it us and them instead of
Mhm.
us together.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Those are wonderful comments and wonderful answers. I want to just spend a couple of minutes before we close out tonight sharing some of the curriculum resources that we think are really exciting and present exciting opportunities or possibilities for the classroom for bringing the kind of complex questions that Professor Capetillo has been speaking about to your curriculum and to your students. And so I've kind of put together a top 5 based on our own research here at Primary Source, our own curation, and also a lot of advice from teachers that we work with every week and every month, and some of our teacher advisors as well. So here we go. Here's a quick tour of all top 5 of these. And for those of you who are on the call tonight or on the webinar tonight, just mention that these are all also, I've been adding them to our Google resource list for the course, so for the webinar series. So you'll find them all there too, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them. So number 1, I want to point out to you is, let me see, I think I've got this, is Primary Source's own resource guides. And those are available on our website. Let's see, Christine, I'm a little jammed here. Hold on. There we go. Thank you. So Primary Source has a set of 60 resource guides, 60 or more, and they are all available to you if you do a quick sign up. And one of them is on the region of Latin America. There's all kinds of films and books and readings and curricular material. Click it, yeah, again. So there you go, and there is an image from, that's a screenshot from our resource guide. So I urge you to take a look at those. There's a lot of really interesting and useful material there, including tabs across the top. You'll see there the tabs are tabs for migration, and there are tabs for the teaching with the news and Latin American studies. And okay, Christine, I think I'm ready for the next slide. And one more. Okay, one more. There we go. So the next resource that I want to recommend is this resource, the Border. It's called the Border Resources for Teaching. This is a website that was created by educators with the support of Latin American Studies staff at the University of New Mexico. And the purpose of this collection is to expand and enhance classroom discussions of the U.S.-Mexican border. It's really an excellent set of materials. It includes a lot of subtopics, which you can see there on the screen, including narratives and literature, visual representations, physical landscapes, and a whole segment on immigration, economics. It's terrific. And there are all manner of lesson plans built around primary sources. So that is a favorite learning opportunity or teaching resource that we recommend as well. The next one on my list is one that's become a real favorite. We've been talking up a lot in the last few years because it's become so excellent and really developed. But you may know from past years, the Pulitzer Center was called the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. Now it's a center for investigative journalism, and they have developed a very dynamic K through 12 education department that works with the journalists in their reporting projects to create materials, and then teachers write lesson plans based on those materials. So this is really very high level material, really beautifully done. The lessons involve students in a lot of great critical thinking, great literacy practices, looking skills, reading activities, critical thinking and discussion, critical media analysis. There are usually photographs and short videos that go along with the projects. And icing on the cake is that one of the things that the Pulitzer Center offers to classrooms is an opportunity to Skype with the journalists who have done the reporting projects that the lessons are based on. So you can sign up and bring a journalist into your classroom to talk about Guatemala, Honduras, what the journalist experienced and saw in their work, in their reporting. This is based on a collection of 3 different reporting projects, as it's been a big push for the Pulitzer Center in recent years. So that is another one I highly recommend. As for this dilemma of teaching about the drug wars and narco trafficking and their effects on society. I am interested in Jorge's approach tonight that he shared, and much of what you said, I think, pushes us to think about, I would say, follow the money to teach the economics of this. It's a very big international business enterprise that we're talking about, but nobody that I know yet has done a lot of writing on that. And I think, for example, the trial, the El Chapo trial, revealed a lot about how the structures of this business works, and that was fascinating. I did notice that the New York Times Learning site had a lesson for ELL students on El Chapo. So that was kind of intriguing to me, a little small lesson on that, but it was interesting. So I put that up on our website. But in any case, how to teach about the drug wars in a responsible way that's helpful to students. It's such a hard topic because of the really horrific violence often involved, and topics that people would much rather not go there. But I crowdsourced this. I threw this question out to a lot of my teacher contacts, and I just found that many have turned to using this film, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, if not all, and that's the 2004 drama Maria, Full of Grace, which was produced in Colombia and the United States. It has a 17-year-old protagonist who gets talked into becoming a drug mule, drug transporter. In the course of the film, there's parts of it that are very hard to watch and horrible, but there are also segments so teachers have tended to use pieces of that film. Some have shown the film in full. And I did want to point out to you a really excellent teaching guide that was created by a global education organization in the UK. And that is linked here and on our website. So that's one that I think is an approach to take. And then finally, to leave us with a little bit more of the human side, this UNICEF resource, Growing Up Surrounded by Violence in Central America, is a project to collect stories of young people whose lives themselves have been distorted and disrupted by the drug gangs and by the cartels. And they're very moving testimonials with beautiful photographs. And it really, again, brings front and center the human experience. So I think that's always of such importance in our teaching and when we work with students to humanize these situations and scenarios. So that's 5 approaches, 5 opportunities and resources that you might check out. I hope that you'll think about how to handle this very difficult material in your classroom and with your students and develop some new lessons. We are closing in on the end of our webinar this evening. Jorge, is there anything that you'd like to, if there's anything you'd like to add or say as we finish up? Back with us?
Yes, hello?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, we can hear you.
No?
Yeah, thank you so much again for being with us tonight. Is there any final thought you want to share?
No, I think it was a very fruitful conversation. I think that this is a topic that we have to go back to again and again and again. It's very complicated. There's too many people involved. There's too many countries. There's too many groups, etc., etc. It's fascinating, but it's also very painful sometimes to talk about
Yeah.
so much violence and so much poverty and so much. Racism and violence. I mean, it's one of those topics that you know. I guess there's no clear solution about. But if we don't talk about it, it's going to become even more difficult to address.
Well, thank you. That was a really, really succinct and very wise comment, and I think a perfect way to remind us that that we can't just bury our heads in the sand. And I applaud those of you who took your evening this evening to dwell on what's a subject many of us would rather turn our faces away from. But you've been a terrific audience, great questions. Thank you so much for your attention, for sticking with us. Jorge, very, very grateful to you for being with us tonight. And it was really a terrific session. We learned a great deal. So thank you all for joining us. And we will see you hopefully in just a week and a half for the last of our webinar series. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Good night.